15-foot Bigfoot emerges from a lake. Fishermen drop their cameras in panic. It happened on a quiet morning at one of the deepest lakes in the country. Two seasoned fishermen were out before sunrise, expecting nothing but trout and calm water. Then the silence fell. No birds, no insects, just the eerie echo of wood knocks drifting across the mist. That's when they spotted a strange structure on the shoreline. Snapped branches stacked into a towering shape, and a musky odor rolling across the water that made their stomachs turn. But nothing prepared them for what came next. The lake beneath their boat began to bubble, and then, out of the shallows, a massive, shaggy figure, at least 15 feet tall, dripping with water. In pure shock, both men dropped their cameras as the giant shape loomed closer. The authorities later claimed there was no proof, but tracks were found in the mud, and whispers of something ancient tied to these waters go back generations. So what really surfaced that morning? A trick of fear and restore undeniable proof that something impossible lives in the deep. Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you. Lviv spent most of my life around Lake Pendore, and after 32 years working for the Idaho Department of Lands, I thought I knew every inch of its shoreline. The lake stretches like an inland sea across northern Idaho, carved deep by ancient glaciers into a natural wonder that draws fishermen from across the country. At over 1,200 feet deep in some places, it's a body of water that holds more mysteries than answers. My name is Robert Kendrick, and what I'm about to share happened in late August of 2011. I was 65 then, retired for just over 3 years, but still as connected to these waters as I'd been during my forestry career. My fishing partner, Jim Wheeler, had worked alongside me for most of those years before retiring himself. Between us, we had nearly 6 decades of experience on this lake. We weren't just casual weekend anglers. Jim and I had maintained detailed fishing journals since the 1980s, documenting every significant catch with photographs and GPS coordinates. The local fishing forums knew us well, and younger anglers would often seek our advice about the lake's best spots and seasonal patterns. Our reputation for honest reporting and accurate documentation was something we took pride in. That summer morning started like countless others before it. I arrived at Jim's lakeside cabin just before 5 a.m., the sky still ink black and scattered with stars. The air had that particular late summer crispness that hints at the coming fall, hovering around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast promised clear skies and calm waters, perfect conditions for what we had planned. Jim was already on his covered dock, methodically checking our gear by the light of an LED lantern. He'd laid everything out with military precision, something left over from his Vietnam days. Our tackle boxes were open, revealing carefully organized lures and hooks. Two high-end depth finders sat ready to be mounted on the boat, their screens dark for now. We'd been tracking a school of large lake trout for the past few weeks, and today we meant to document their unusual feeding patterns. "Coffee's hot," Jim called out as I approached, gesturing to a steel thermos. "Weather service says we've got a high-pressure system moving in, should keep things stable until at least mid-afternoon." I poured myself a cup while Jim continued his equipment check. The steam rose in lazy spirals, barely visible in the lantern light. The lake stretched before us, black and mirror-smooth in the pre-dawn darkness. Only the gentle lap of water against the dock pilings broke the silence. "Did you bring the new underwater camera?" I asked, knowing Jim had recently invested in some serious photography equipment. He'd been especially keen on documenting the unusual size of some of our recent catches. "Got it right here," he replied, patting a waterproof case rated for 300 feet. "Figure we might get some interesting footage of those big lakers when they come up to feed." We spent the next hour methodically preparing the boats. Jim's 24-foot Alumacraft was a reliable vessel we'd used countless times before. Every piece of equipment had its place. Emergency gear in the forward locker, tackle organized in the center console, our documentation equipment secured in waterproof containers. We'd learned long ago that preparation was everything on Pen d'Ori. The lake's immense size and depth meant conditions could change quickly, and experience had taught us to respect its moods. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as we finished our preparations, a thin line of grey appearing above the distant mountains. The lake remained unusually still, creating that rare mirror effect that makes it impossible to tell where water ends and sky begins. In all my years on Pen d'Ori, these were the moments I treasured most. The quiet anticipation before pushing off, the promise of what the day might hold. Local legends about the lake had always circulated among the old-timers. Stories of impossible depths, of things seen in the water that defied explanation. Jim and I had always approached such tales with professional skepticism, preferring to trust our instruments and our eyes rather than campfire stories. But there was something about the lake's vastness, its ancient depths, that made even the most practical person wonder what might lurk in those cold, dark waters. As we made our final checks, the first birds began their morning songs from the surrounding forest. The air remained perfectly still, and the lake's surface looked like polished obsidian. Everything pointed to an ideal day for documenting our latest fishing expedition. Neither of us had any way of knowing that this ordinary morning would mark the beginning of something far beyond our experience, something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about. Lake Pen d'Ori. The first hints of dawn were breaking as we eased Jim's boat away from the dock. Years of practice made our launch routine almost mechanical. I handled the bowline while Jim guided us smoothly into deeper water with the electric trolling motor. The lake's surface remained unnaturally flat, creating mirror images of the surrounding pines that were just becoming visible in the growing light. Water temperatures holding at 58 degrees, Jim noted, checking one of our digital displays. Should have those lake trout right where we want them. I nodded, already working on setting up our first lines. We had a system perfected. Over decades, downriggers on the port side for deep running lures, flat lines to starboard for working the upper water column. The familiar routine of checking leaders and testing drags helped settle my mind into the rhythm of the day. "Remember that 38-pounder we pulled up last September?" I asked, carefully attaching a silver spoon to my main line. "Same conditions as today." Jim chuckled while adjusting our heading. "How could I forget? Took us 45 minutes to land that monster. Still have the pictures on my wall." The grey light was strengthening now, revealing more of the lake's vast expanse. We were heading toward a deeper section about 2 miles offshore, where underwater shelves created perfect feeding grounds for the big predators we were after. Our depth finder showed 120 feet beneath the keel, the bottom dropping away steadily as we moved further out. It was around 6:15 in the morning when I first noticed something odd. The dawn chorus of birds, which had been growing steadily with the increasing light, suddenly went quiet. Not the gradual tapering off you might expect, but a complete and immediate silence that felt almost physical in its totality. Jim noticed it too. I could tell by the way his hands tightened slightly on the wheel. We'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that when nature goes quiet, it's usually for a reason. "Bit strange," he muttered, scanning the shoreline that was now about half a mile behind us. No wind to speak of either. He was right. The lake's surface remained perfectly still, creating an almost disorienting effect where the water and sky seemed to merge at the horizons. The silence felt heavy, pressing in around our boat despite the open water surrounding us. I kept working on our lines, trying to maintain the familiar routine, but found myself moving more slowly, listening more intently. The only sounds were the soft hum of the motor and the occasional click of fishing gear. Even these seemed somehow muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. "Might be a storm coming that the weather service missed," I suggested, though the sky remained clear and the barometer hadn't dropped. We both knew it was a weak explanation, but sometimes speaking aloud helps normalize unusual situations. By 6:30, we'd reached our intended fishing spot. The depth finder now showed 240 feet, and the morning light had strengthened enough to reveal the full scope of our surroundings. Lake Pend-Oreille stretched away in all directions, its surface still maintaining that unsettling, glass-like quality. The vastness of the lake had never bothered me before, but something about the absolute stillness made the water seem both endless and somehow confining. Jim cut the motor, letting us drift. In normal conditions, there would always be some movement, ripples from distant boats, wind patterns on the water, the natural motion of the lake itself. But we sat as if suspended in place, the water around, us looking more like polished stone than liquid. "Never seen it this still," Jim said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Whether he was speaking softly out of instinct or in response to the unnatural silence, I couldn't tell. Not in 40 years on this lake. I finished setting our last line, the small splash of the lure hitting the water seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet. We had 6 lines deployed now, a spread that had proven effective countless times before. But something about the familiar routine felt different, almost inappropriate in the strange stillness. The sun was now fully above the horizon, but the grey light hadn't warmed as it should have. Instead, it created an odd flat illumination that seemed to rob everything of depth and shadow. The distant shoreline appeared closer than it should have, while the middle distance stretched away in a way that played tricks with perspective. We sat in that strange silence, our lines trailing into the dark water, surrounded by a stillness so complete it seemed to hum. Both of us were experienced enough to trust our instincts, and everything about this morning was setting off warning signals that were hard to ignore or explain away. Jim reached for his coffee thermos, and the small sound of the cap unscrewing seemed to echo across the water. "You know," he said, pouring carefully to avoid any unnecessary noise, "I've been thinking about those stories old Tom used to tell, about the times the lake would go quiet like this." I knew exactly which stories he meant. Tom Reynolds had been a fishing guide on Pend-Oreille for over 50 years before passing away in 2004. He'd had plenty of tales about the lake's strange moods, stories we'd always dismissed as entertaining exaggerations. But sitting there in that unnatural silence, those old stories suddenly felt more relevant than I wanted to admit. The sound came just after 7 o'clock. I was adjusting the depth on one of our downriggers when a sharp knock echoed across the water. It wasn't particularly loud, but in that unnatural silence, it carried with perfect clarity 3 distinct impacts, wood on wood, or perhaps stone on stone, spaced exactly 2 seconds apart. The sound came from somewhere along the eastern shoreline, though the distance and the way sound travels over water made it difficult to pinpoint exactly. "Did you hear that?" Jim asked, already reaching for his phone. He'd gotten into the habit of recording anything unusual ever since retiring from the Forest Service. Said it helped keep his observation skills sharp. "Yeah," I replied, straightening up slowly. "Sounds like someone's out there." Jim activated his phone's recording app and set it on the console. "Could be campers breaking down their site," he offered, but we both knew the sound wasn't quite right for that. It had been too deliberate, too measured in its spacing. "Maybe logging crews," I suggested, though I knew the nearest active cutting area was miles away. Sound carries strange over water sometimes. We listened intently for several minutes, our fishing lines forgotten. The silence had somehow deepened after those knocks, if that was even possible. No birds had resumed calling, no insects buzzed, and the water remained that unsettling mirror-smooth surface. Hunters wouldn't be out this early in the season. Jim mused, more thinking aloud than really suggesting it as a possibility. He picked up his binoculars and slowly scanned the shoreline, and they sure wouldn't be making noise like that. The knock came again, same pattern, 3 distinct impacts, 2 seconds apart. This time it seemed to come from slightly further, north along the shore, though again the water played tricks with directional sound. "That's got to be at least half a mile away," I said, trying to calculate distances in my head. "But it sounds closer, doesn't it?" Jim nodded, adjusting something on his phone's recording settings. "Too sharp for that distance." "Too clear." He paused, then added, "Too deliberate." We'd both spent enough time in these woods to know the normal sounds: branches falling, rocks tumbling, the various noises that humans and animals make while moving through terrain. This was different. This had purpose behind it. "Should we head over there?" I asked, though something in my gut suggested staying put. Could be someone signaling for help. Jim shook his head slowly. If someone needed help, they'd be using a whistle, making noise continuously. "This is," he trailed off, searching for the right word. "Communication," I finished for him. The word felt heavy as soon as I said it. We let the boat drift, neither of us quite willing to start the motor and break the silence. The sun was fully up now, but that strange, flat quality to the light persisted. The shoreline seemed to shift. Between looking deceptively close and impossibly far away, playing tricks with our depth perception. "You remember that research team that came through in 2009? Jim asked suddenly. "The ones looking into those vocalizations," people reported. I nodded. They'd spent 6 weeks setting up recording stations around the lake, though. I'd never heard what came of their study. Most locals had written them off as another group of enthusiasts chasing legends. But they'd seemed professional enough. The knock sequence came a 3rd time, now definitely further north. Whatever was making the sound was moving along the shoreline, maintaining roughly the same distance from the water's edge. Jim checked his phone to make sure it was still recording. "Tom used to talk about hearing things like this," he said quietly. "Said sometimes you'd get answers from different spots around the lake, like they were talking to each other. As if, on cue, a responding knock echoed from the western shore, fainter, but unmistakably the same pattern. 3 impacts, 2 seconds apart. Jim and I exchanged glances, neither of us quite willing to voice what we were thinking. "Could be an echo," I suggested weakly, knowing it wasn't. The timing was wrong for an echo, and the sound quality was too distinct. "Yeah," Jim agreed, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe it either. "Could be." We sat in silence for several more minutes, our fishing lines trailing forgotten in the dark water. The knocking didn't repeat, but that unnatural quiet remained, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the hull and the occasional creak of fishing gear. I checked my watch. 7:15 in the morning. The mist was finally starting to lift, revealing more of the shoreline with each passing minute. We'd been drifting slowly, keeping our eyes on the eastern bank where those knocks had come from. That's when my partner spotted something that made him grab the binoculars from under his seat. "Take a look at this," he said, passing them to me. About 50 yards up from that fallen cedar, just where the tree line starts. Through the lenses, I could make out what looked like a crude structure, branches arranged in a teepee formation. But this wasn't any regular camping setup. The branches were thick, some looking freshly snapped, and the whole thing stood at least 12 feet tall. Too big for kids messing around, too deliberate to be storm damage. "We should get closer," my partner said, already reaching for his camcorder. "Document this while the light's good." I hesitated, but curiosity won out. I guided our boat toward the shore, cutting the motor about 30 feet out and letting us drift in. The structure looked even more impressive up close. Massive branches, some as thick as my thigh, had been broken, not cut, and arranged with what looked like purpose. The breaks were fresh, with sap still visible on some of the splintered ends. Getting this on video, my partner muttered, panning slowly across the scene. "Look at how those cross pieces are woven together at the top." That took some serious strength. That's when the smell hit us, a heavy, musky odor that drifted across the water. It reminded me of wet dog mixed with something else, something wild. The kind of smell that triggers something primitive in your brain, telling you you're not alone. "You getting that smell?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," he replied, still filming, "like something's been marking its territory. Never smelled anything quite like it in all my years fighting forest fires." We stayed there for several minutes, documenting everything we could see. The structure cast an odd shadow across the water, and the longer we stayed, the more that musky smell seemed to intensify. There was something deeply unsettling about it all. The deliberate placement, the raw strength needed to break those branches, the territorial marking. "Think we should go ashore?" my partner asked, but I could tell from his tone he already knew my answer. "Not today," I said, starting the motor. "Let's finish getting this on film from here." The smell was making my stomach turn, and every instinct I'd developed over decades in these woods was screaming at me to keep my distance. The structure on shore held our attention so completely that I barely noticed our drift at first. The current was gentle but persistent, drawing us closer to the shallows near the crude teepee. Bill kept filming with his handheld camera while I tried to make sense of what we were seeing. The branches weren't just piled together, they were woven and twisted with deliberate precision, creating a shelter that had to stand at least 12 feet tall. "Should we maybe back off a bit?" Bill's voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before. The musky smell was getting stronger, reminding me of wet dog mixed with something earthier, more primitive. I reached for the trolling motor control, but before I could engage it, something changed in the water around us. At first, it was just a few bubbles breaking the surface, scattered and random like fish rising. But then the disturbance grew more organized, creating circular patterns that didn't match any natural movement I'd seen in my 30 years on this lake. "Probably just a big sturgeon," I said, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was wrong. The lake's surface began to ripple in concentric circles around our boat, the water dancing with an energy that seemed to come from something much larger than any fish. Bill lowered his camera, his hands visibly shaking. "Tom, we need to." The bubbling intensified, creating a churning effect that rocked our 16-foot boat. The sound of rushing water filled the air, drowning out the distant knock that had been echoing intermittently from the shore. The musky odor became overwhelming, mixing with the smell of disturbed lake bottom. I fumbled with the trolling motor, but the water's movement had us in its grip now. We were being pulled into whatever phenomenon was unfolding beneath us. The morning mist that had been burning off suddenly felt thick and oppressive, limiting our visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. The lake's surface broke in a massive upheaval about 10 yards from our stern. Water cascaded off something dark and enormous as it began to rise from the depths. The displacement created a wave that lifted our boat's bow, tilting us at an angle that sent our tackle boxes sliding. Bill's camera captured everything, though his breathing had become rapid and shallow. "Oh my God," he whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of churning water. "Oh my God." The mass continued its slow ascent, water sheeting off its form as it broke the surface. Our boat rocked violently in the turbulence, and I grabbed the gunwale to steady myself, my knuckles white with tension. Whatever was emerging from Lake Pendore, it was far bigger than anything I'd ever encountered in these waters. The structure on shore held our attention so completely that I barely noticed our drift at first. The current was gentle but persistent, drawing us closer to the shallows near the crude teepee. Bill kept filming with his handheld camera while I tried to make sense of what we were seeing. The branches weren't just piled together, they were woven and twisted with deliberate precision, creating a shelter that had to stand at least 15 feet tall. That's when I felt a deep vibration through the aluminum hull of our boat. The water around us began to bubble, like someone had turned on jets beneath the surface. "Bill," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "something's not right." The lake's surface erupted. Water cascaded in sheets as something massive rose from the depths, not 20 feet from our port side. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, a dark, hulking form, covered in thick, matted fur that shed water in streams. The creature stood upright in the shallows, water rolling off shoulders broader than any bear I'd ever encountered. Its head alone was massive, positioned atop a thick, muscular neck. Jesus Christ! Bill's camera clattered to the floor of the boat. The sound seemed to draw the beast's attention. It turned toward us, and I caught a glimpse of a face that was neither human nor entirely animal, a blend that sent ice through my veins. The thing had to be at least 15 feet tall, towering over our small fishing boat. I lunged for the ignition key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The creature took a step toward us, causing a wave that rocked our boat violently. Bill lost his balance, crashing into the tackle box. His camera skittered across the deck, recording nothing but confused audio hour, panicked breathing, the splash of water, and a deep, resonant sound that might have been breathing or growling. "Start the damn boat." Bill's voice cracked with fear. I finally got the engine running, throwing it into reverse. The beast raised one massive armor gesture I couldn't interpret as either threatening or defensive, but I wasn't staying to find out. Water sprayed as I gunned the motor, backing us toward deeper water as fast as I dared. The creature remained visible for several more seconds, its dark form stark against the morning mist, before slowly sinking back into the lake. the water churned and bubbled in its wake, creating waves that rocked our boat even as we retreated. Neither of us spoke for what felt like minutes, both trying to process what we'd just witnessed. When I finally looked at Bill, his face was ashen, his hands gripping the gunwale so tight his knuckles were white. The lake's surface gradually calmed, leaving no evidence of what had just transpired, except for the garbled audio on Bill's fallen camera and our racing hearts. The boat's engine roared as we tore across the lake, neither of us daring to look back. My hands trembled on the wheel, knuckles white, as spray kicked up around us. Bill had dropped his camera somewhere in the chaos, and I could hear him muttering Jesus Christ over and over, his voice barely audible above the motor. We didn't slow down until we reached the opposite shore, a good 3 miles from what we'd seen. I cut the engine, letting us drift the final few yards until we bumped against a fallen log near the bank. The silence felt oppressive after the thunder of our escape. "We need to call someone," Bill said finally, his clothes dripping lake water onto the aluminum floor. He was shivering, though the August morning had grown warm. Fish and game, maybe, or the sheriff's department. I shook my head, still staring at the water, and tell them what, exactly? That we saw a 15-foot what? They'll think we're drunk or looking for attention. My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming, though I couldn't remember if I had. "We have proof," Bill insisted, but then his face fell as he remembered the lost camera. Had proof, even with footage, who'd believe? Us. Remember what happened to Pete Carson when he reported those tracks up by Scotchman Peak? The local paper made him look like a fool. He had 2 transfer stations just to escape the jokes. Water lapped against the boat's hull, a sound that had always been comforting before. Now it made me flinch. Every ripple, every shadow beneath the surface seemed threatening. I kept scanning the shoreline, though we were miles from where it happened. So we just, pretend this never happened. Bill's voice cracked. He was right, the idea of carrying this alone felt impossible. But the alternative seemed worse. "Maybe we talk to search and rescue first," I suggested. "Off the record. See if they've heard anything similar. They know these waters better than anyone." Bill nodded slowly, but I could tell he was still processing. We sat there for nearly an hour, neither of us willing to move. The lake stretched out before us, beautiful and familiar and suddenly alien. Every few minutes, one of us would start to speak, then think better of it. Finally, I reached for the key. "We should head back." The words felt heavy in my mouth. "But we take the long way around, stay in the deep water." Bill didn't argue. As I turned the key, he gripped the side of the boat so hard his fingers left marks in the metal. The engine's rumble couldn't quite drown out the memory of that other sound, the massive displacement of water, the impossible sight of something rising from depths that suddenly seemed inadequate to hide it. We didn't slow down until we reached the opposite shore, a good 5 miles from where that thing had emerged. Bill and I sat in silence, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull the only sound between us. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and the morning's events kept replaying in my mind like a broken film reel. "We have to tell someone," Bill finally said, his voice hoarse. "This isn't something we can just keep to ourselves." I nodded slowly, knowing he was right. After 40 years of working these forests, we'd built up enough credibility that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. "Game." "Warden Thompson," I suggested. "He's been around long enough to know we're not the type to make up stories. The decision to speak up wasn't easy. We spent another hour on that quiet shore, rehearsing how we'd explain what we'd seen without sounding completely insane. The structure on the shore, the knocking sounds, the massive figure rising from the water, it all seemed impossible in the clear light of day. 2 days later, we found ourselves sitting across from Warden Thompson in his small office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he clicked his pen, ready to take our statement. I could feel the skepticism radiating from him, even though he maintained a professional demeanor. "Start from the beginning," he said, pulling out an official incident report form. "Just the facts as you remember them." Bill cleared his throat. We were out early, around 5:30 in the morning. Everything was normal until the birds went quiet. His voice grew stronger as he continued, describing the knocking sounds and the strange structure we'd photographed. "And you're certain it wasn't other campers?" Thompson asked, making neat notes in his notebook. "Warden," I interjected, "we've been on this lake longer than most folks have been alive." "What we saw," I paused, choosing my words carefully. "What came out of that water wasn't natural, wasn't anything I'd seen in 40 years of forestry work." Thompson's pen stopped moving. He looked up at us, his expression unreadable. "You understand? I'll need to investigate the site," he said finally. "Document any evidence, take measurements, photographs." "That's what we want," Bill replied. "We're not looking to start rumors or cause trouble. People should know what's out there." The warden nodded, flipping through his calendar. "I can head out tomorrow morning. Would you be willing to show me the exact location?" We exchanged glances, neither of us eager to return to that spot, but we had come this far. "Yes," I said firmly. "We'll take you there." Thompson began filling out the proper forms, his methodical approach somehow making the whole thing feel more real, more official. As he wrote, I couldn't help but wonder what we'd find when we returned to that quiet corner of Lake Pend Oredge. The next morning, we met Game Warden Thompson at the public boat launch. His expression remained professionally neutral as he reviewed his notepad, though I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested skepticism. The morning was crisp, with mist still clinging to the surface of Lake Pend Oredge. "Let's see these tracks you mentioned," Thompson said, climbing into his department boat. We followed in ours, leading him to the shoreline where we'd encountered whatever it was. The mudflats near the water's edge stretched for about 50 yards, and as we approached, even Thompson's composed demeanor showed a crack of surprise. There, pressed into the mud, were footprints that made my stomach clench. They were unmistakably humanoid in shape, but the size each impression had to be at least 16 inches long. What struck me most was the spacing. These weren't normal strides. The distance between prints stretched to nearly 8 feet apart. Thompson knelt beside one of the clearer impressions, placing his department-issued ruler beside it for scale. His camera clicked methodically as he documented the scene. "I'm going to try casting this one," he announced, reaching for his plaster kit. I noticed his hands were steady, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. The casting process seemed to take forever. Thompson worked carefully, mixing the plaster and pouring it into the deepest impression. But the muddy substrate wasn't ideal, too wet, too unstable. As the plaster set, the edges of the cast began crumbling. Thompson's jaw clenched in frustration. "At least we have the photos," Bill offered. But we all knew photographs without proper scale references would be questioned. The ruler had only been visible in a few shots before the rising tide began to erase the evidence. Thompson's official notes were a study in careful language. I watched over his shoulder as he wrote, Multiple large impressions observed in mud. Approximate length, 16 inches. Possible human origin. Cast attempted, but unsuccessful due to substrate conditions. Photos taken, but inconclusive due to poor preservation and lighting conditions. He paused, pen hovering over the paper. I have to maintain objectivity here, he said, not meeting our eyes. Whatever made these tracks, I can't officially endorse any particular theory, but, he added, closing his notebook, I've worked these shores for 15 years. Never seen prints like these before. Not from bears, not from moose, not from any wildlife I know. The tide was rising steadily now, water, lapping at the edges of the remaining tracks. Within an hour, they'd be gone completely, leaving us with only blurred photographs and a crumbling plaster cast as evidence of what we'd witnessed. After that day at the mudflats with Warden Thompson, Bill and I handled things differently. I watched my fishing partner of 15 years transform into someone I barely recognized. He sold his boat within a week, cancelled our annual autumn fishing plans, and stopped taking my calls altogether. When I finally cornered him at the local hardware store, his hands trembled as he arranged nuts and bolts on a shelf. I'm done with Pandore, he said flatly. You should be too, Jim. What we saw, it ain't natural. I've got grandkids now. Can't risk. He shook his head and walked away, leaving his shopping basket behind, but I couldn't let it go. The image of that massive figure rising from the water haunted my dreams. I found myself driving out to the lake almost daily, sometimes sitting for hours in my truck with a pair of binoculars, scanning the shoreline. The logical part of my brain said I was being foolish, but something deeper, more primitive, knew we'd witnessed something extraordinary. 3 weeks after the incident, I took my first solo trip back onto the water. The morning was dead calm, with that heavy silence we'd experienced before. I positioned myself about 200 yards from where we'd seen the structure, killing the engine to drift. At 9:15 in the morning, I heard it 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, echoing across the water. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone to record. But by then the sounds had stopped. I started asking around town, carefully at first. Old Pete at the bait shop mentioned his grandfather's stories about lake apes from the 1930s. A retired logger named Marcus described finding twisted trees in patterns that no wind could make near the North Shore. The local diner became my research center, where I'd nurse coffee for hours, listening to elderly residents share tales they'd kept quiet for decades. Sarah, the waitress who'd worked there 30 years, told me about her uncle's encounter in 1978. He was night fishing for sturgeon, she whispered, leaning close over the counter. Said something walked through his campsite, not like a bear on 2 legs, left footprints bigger than anything the game wardens could explain. The stories kept coming. A retired search and rescue volunteer admitted they'd found strange structures. During training exercises, massive branches woven together in ways that seemed deliberate. A former Forest Service employee spoke of unexplained vocalizations that made their hair stand on end. Each account pulled me deeper, building a pattern that stretched back generations. While Bill refused to even drive past the lake anymore, I found myself mapping sightings, documenting coordinates, and planning my next trip out. The lake had its hooks in me now, and I needed answers. I'm done with Pendoredge, he said flatly, not meeting my eyes. You should be too. But I couldn't let it go. While he retreated into the safety of denial, I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery. The Bonner County Historical Society became my second home. I spent countless hours in their cramped research room, poring through yellowed newspaper clippings and dusty files from the 1970s. The more I dug, the more patterns emerged. July 19th, 1973. 2 Forest Service employees reported an unusually large, hair-covered figure wading in the shallows near Granite Point. August 3rd, 1970. A family camping at Whiskey Rock documented strange, knocking sounds and found their canoe dragged 30 yards up the beach overnight. The reports went on and on, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. The tribal archives proved even more revealing. The Kalispel people spoke of ancient beings they called the SNPCKSTX, water guardians, who protected the lake's depths. Their stories described creatures that could remain submerged for hours, emerging at twilight to patrol their territory. The similarities to what we'd witnessed were impossible to ignore. I tried sharing my findings with my old partner. "Look at this pattern," I said, spreading photocopied articles across his kitchen table. "These sightings go back decades. What we saw wasn't just some random thing." He pushed the papers away, his face tight with anger. "You need to stop this," he warned. "People are starting to talk. They're saying we made it all up for attention. Since when do you care what people think?" I demanded. "We know what we saw. What we saw was a mistake," he snapped. "Bad light, too much coffee, whatever. I'm not letting this ruin what's left of my reputation. But each dismissal only fueled my determination. I started taking solo trips to the lake, setting up trail cameras along the shoreline where we'd seen the structure. The knocks came again during my 3rd visit, 3 sharp reports echoing across the water at dusk. I recorded them on my phone, but the audio was too distorted to be conclusive. My partner finally stopped answering his door altogether. His wife told me he'd started seeing a counselor, trying to process the trauma, as she put it. But I knew the real trauma wasn't what we'd seen that day. It was the weight of denying it, of trying to force the impossible back into the box of the ordinary. The evidence was there for anyone willing to look. In those quiet hours at the Historical Society, surrounded by forgotten accounts and faded photographs, I began to understand that our encounter was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of mystery. I've spent thousands of dollars on trail cameras over the past few months. Every weekend, I drive out to Lake Pendored under the cover of darkness, setting them up in different locations around that haunting cove. The routine has become almost mechanical now, checking SD cards, replacing batteries, adjusting angles. My wife says I'm obsessed. Maybe she's right. Last night, I retrieved another batch of footage. Sitting in my truck with my laptop, I scrolled through hundreds of images, frame by frame. Most showed nothing but leaves stirring in the wind or small animals scurrying past. But then I found something that made my hands shake. At 2:17 in the morning, 3 days ago, something massive moved through the frame. The image was distorted by water droplets on the lens, but I could make out a dark shape, easily twice the height of the surrounding brush. The next frame showed broken branches, snapped clean off as if they were twigs. I've shown these photos to Mark, my fishing partner from that day, but he just shakes his head. "Let it go," he tells me. "Nothing good can come from digging deeper." But how can I let it go when I'm so close? The tribal stories I've uncovered, the historical sightings, they all point to something living in these waters. Something that's been here longer than any of us. My daughter asked me yesterday why. I missed her soccer game. I had been at the library again, pouring through microfiche records from the 1970s. The look of disappointment in her eyes cut deep, but I couldn't explain that I was trying to protect her by understanding what's out there. My wife barely speaks to me anymore, except to remind me of missed dinner plans or forgotten commitments. The trail cameras keep capturing strange anomalies, unexplained shadows moving through the water, ripples that don't match any known wave patterns, and occasionally those haunting blurred shapes that could be anything or nothing at all. Started categorizing them, creating a database of times, locations, and weather conditions. The rational part of my mind knows this is consuming me, but I can't stop. Last week, I found one camera completely destroyed, its metal casing crushed as if it had been squeezed in a giant fist. The memory card was missing. When I reported it to the local sheriff's office, they dismissed it as vandalism. But who would venture so deep into these woods just to destroy a single camera? My family is planning a vacation next month. I should be excited, but all I can think about is what I might miss while I'm gone. What if that's when it finally shows itself again? What if that's when I could get the proof I need to validate everything we saw that day? I've spent thousands of dollars on trail cameras over the past 3 months, but the images they capture only deepen the mystery. Every morning, I trudge down to check the memory cards, hoping for that one clear shot that would validate everything we saw that day on the lake. Instead, I get fragments, dark shapes moving through mist, branches snapping at heights no bear could reach, and strange distortions in the water that my rational mind struggles to explain. Last week, I finally worked up the courage to approach some of the search and rescue volunteers who train regularly around Lake Pend Oredge. I caught up with them at the local diner after one of their monthly meetings. At first, they were hesitant, exchanging knowing glances over their coffee cups. But once I mentioned the knocking sounds, their professional facades began to crack. "We've heard things during night training exercises," one of them admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sounds that don't match any wildlife we know." He nervously stirred his coffee, looking over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. Another volunteer, a woman with 15 years of SAR experience, chimed in. "There was this one time during a winter drill near the eastern shoreline. We heard what sounded like wood on wood, but rhythmic, deliberate. 3 distinct knocks, then silence." She laughed, but it was forced, uncomfortable. We radioed base to check if another team was out there, but we were the only unit in the area that night. The others nodded, each sharing their own experiences. In hushed tones, strange vocalizations echoing across the water during twilight hours. Unusually large tracks found in muddy areas that disappeared before they could be properly documented. Equipment moved or disturbed when no one was around. "Look," said the first volunteer, leaning forward, "we can't officially acknowledge any of this. We have a reputation to maintain." But he paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's a reason we always pair up during shoreline searches, even in broad daylight." Their stories matched patterns I'd been documenting, the locations, the types of sounds, the timing of encounters. Each account was delivered with the same mix of professional detachment and underlying unease, often punctuated with nervous laughter or quick disclaimers about how they couldn't explain what they'd experienced. As they spoke, I noticed how they'd instinctively formed a tight circle around our table, voices low, eyes occasionally darting to the diner's windows as darkness settled outside. These weren't attention seekers or thrill chasers. These were trained professionals who'd spent countless hours in these woods. People who knew the difference between ordinary wilderness sounds and something that defied explanation. The late October wind cut through my jacket as I set up camp, near the cove where we'd first seen it. My wife had stopped answering my calls 2 weeks ago, and honestly, I couldn't blame her, but I needed answers. The trail cameras hadn't given me anything definitive, just those maddening partial images. That could be explained away. Tonight would be different. I had my handheld camcorder, 3 backup batteries, and enough supplies to last 48 hours. I positioned my tent about 50 yards from the water's edge, just inside a natural clearing that gave me a clear view of both the lake and the surrounding forest. The sun set early this time of year, and by 6:30 in the evening, darkness had completely enveloped the shoreline. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs. As I huddled inside my sleeping bag, camcorder ready, hours passed. The digital display on my watch showed 11:45 when the first anomaly occurred. Complete silence. The constant background noise of small animals and insects just stopped. My hands trembled as I switched on the camcorder's night vision, scanning the tree line. At 12:17, the splashing started. Not the gentle lapping of waves, but powerful, deliberate disturbances in the water. Through the camcorder's screen, I could see the lake's surface erupting in places, as if something massive was moving beneath it. The splashing grew closer to shore, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, methodical footfalls, crushing, branches and undergrowth just beyond my field of view. Whatever it was circling my position. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to keep the camera steady. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a deep, musky odor that reminded me of wet fur and decay. A branch snapped directly behind my tent, and I could hear deep, rhythmic breathing, not animal, not quite human either. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I got the footage I'd spent months trying to capture. Instead, raw panic took over. I scrambled out of the tent, dropping the camcorder in my haste. The breathing behind me turned into a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. I ran, stumbling through the darkness, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of camping gear and recording equipment. The heavy footfalls followed, matching my pace with terrifying ease. Only when I reached my truck, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, did the pursuit stop. Through the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving at the forest's edge, a dark shape that seemed to absorb what little moonlight there was. Then it was gone, melting back into the tree line as silently as a shadow. The aftermath of that night changed everything. I left my gear scattered by the lake, running blindly through the darkness until I reached my truck. The next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to return, most of my equipment was gone, dragged into the water, or simply vanished. The few items I recovered were crushed beyond recognition, including my $1,000 camcorder. Tom, my fishing partner from that first encounter, refused to speak with me after hearing about my overnight attempt. "You're going to get yourself killed," he told me in what would be our final conversation. "I'm done with all of this. That lake, whatever's in there, it's not meant for us to understand." He sold his boat that winter and moved to Arizona, where he now spends his retirement playing golf and deliberately avoiding large bodies of water. I tried reaching out to the game warden who'd taken our initial report, but he'd been transferred to another district. His replacement showed zero interest in pursuing the investigation, stating that the original file had been classified as a routine wildlife disturbance. When I pressed him about the plaster cast of the footprint, he claimed no such evidence. existed in their records. The search and rescue volunteers who had shared their stories with me suddenly became unavailable or changed their accounts. Probably just bears, one finally admitted under pressure. We get worked up sometimes during night training. Imagination plays tricks, but the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. My obsession cost me everything that mattered. My wife filed for divorce, citing my unhealthy fixation and increasingly erratic behavior in the paperwork. My adult children stopped bringing the grandkids around, worried about the stories I might tell them. The fishing tackle shop, where I'd worked part-time, asked me to leave after customers, complained about my constant questions regarding lake activity. Looking back now, I understand their concerns. The evidence I gathered fills 3 storage boxes: blurry photographs, garbled audio recordings, newspaper clippings dating back to the 1970s, and notebooks full of witness accounts that no one will now verify. Either we all experienced a massive shared delusion that day on the lake, our minds creating patterns from random events, or we glimpsed something that has existed in those waters long before our time, something intelligent enough to remain hidden despite our best efforts to prove its existence. I won't tell you which explanation I believe, but I will offer this warning. Lake Pend Oredge holds secrets in its depths. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, some questions better left unanswered. The price of certainty might be more than you're willing to pay. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.